You know, when you reach my age, you think you've seen enough heartache to toughen your skin and enough blessings to soften it again. But nothing, cuts deeper than watching your own child suffer. As a mother, you spend years protecting them from scraped knees, broken toys, and bad dreams. But no one warns you that one day you might have to protect them from the very person who vowed to love them. I raised my daughter to be strong, to speak up, to know her worth, but somehow, she stumbled into the arms of a man who slowly drained the fire from her spirit. And I didn't see it, because she hid it behind smiles and excuses, the way so many women do when they feel trapped. But the day I walked into that house and saw what he did, saw her reaction to it, I realized this wasn't weakness. This was fear. This was control. This was the quiet, deadly kind of abuse that families whisper about but rarely confront. And I will tell you this. When a mother sees her child in danger, she stops caring about respect, tradition, or keeping the family together. She becomes something else, someone fierce, someone unstoppable. That day, I made one phone call. And everything changed. The morning I decided to visit my daughter was one of those mornings that arrives with a strange weight in the air as if the world itself is holding its breath. I woke up with a strange feeling deep in my chest, something I could not name, but I knew it was not something I should ignore. A mother can forget many things in her life, but she never forgets the invisible thread that ties her heart to her children. It tugs at her spirit, whispers in her ear, and warns her even when the rest of the world is silent. That morning the whisper felt like a shout. I put on my shoes, picked up my bag, and told myself that I only wanted to surprise her. I only wanted to spend time with her. But the truth was, I felt something was wrong long before I saw it with my own eyes. As I drove to her home, I replayed little details that I had pushed aside in recent months. The way her voice would flatten when she said she was fine. The way she paused before answering when I asked if everything was all right. The times she canceled plans with excuses that never really made sense. A mother notices these cracks even when others do not. I had tried to give her space. I had tried to trust that she knew how to navigate her marriage. But deep inside, a fear had grown like a shadow, stretching longer each time I spoke to her. Still, I told myself she was strong. I told myself she was capable. I told myself that love could be complicated but not dangerous. I told myself what many mothers tell themselves when denial feels safer than facing the truth. The closer I got to her street, the heavier the feeling grew. It settled behind my ribs as if a stone had taken shape within me. When I reached the front of her house, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the windows. Everything looked peaceful from the outside. That quiet kind of peaceful that fools strangers but never fools a mother. I stepped out slowly and walked toward the door. I knocked at first in a gentle way, the way a parent does when she wants to surprise her child without startling her. No answer. I knocked again. Still no answer. I reached for the handle, and to my surprise the door was unlocked. I told myself she must be in the kitchen, perhaps cleaning or cooking something. But the moment I stepped inside, I sensed something was terribly wrong. The air felt thick, like it was carrying a secret. The kind of secret that presses against the walls and waits to be discovered. I moved through the hallway, listening for signs of life. A voice, a sound, footsteps, anything at all. What I heard instead was a sharp thud from the living room. A harsh sound that tightened my throat. I followed the noise and stepped into the doorway. That was when I saw it. My daughter standing with fear in her eyes. Her husband towering over her with a look that made my blood run cold. And then the sound came again. His hand striking her cheek with a force that shook her entire body. Her head snapped to the side. Her hair fell across her face. I froze for a moment, not because I did not want to step forward, but because the shock of what I saw rooted me to the floor. There are pains a mother can handle. A scraped knee, a broken heart. But the sight of someone hurting your child is a pain that shatters something sacred inside you. But the worst part was not the slap. The worst part was what happened next. My daughter lifted her hands and clapped. A soft trembling applause that did not belong to joy or agreement but to fear. Pure, silent, choking fear. A fear so deep she had learned to hide it behind obedience. The sound of her hands striking together echoed louder than the slap itself. It echoed through my bones, through my memories, through every moment I had believed she was safe. It echoed through all the times she told me she was fine when she was not. It echoed through the years I assumed she was living the life she had chosen when in truth she had been living under control. I felt something inside me break. A crack so deep I knew it would never fully heal. I stepped into the room, finally unable to stay silent 1 second longer. My voice came out stronger than I expected. Stronger than I felt. I called her name. She turned toward me slowly, her eyes widening the way a trapped animal looks when the cage door suddenly opens. For a second I saw hope flash across her face. Then it disappeared as fast as it came, replaced by terror. Her husband turned around, and when he saw me he did not look embarrassed or surprised. He looked annoyed, as if I had interrupted something routine. Something he believed he had every right to do. I felt my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The room felt smaller with every breath I took. The air tasted sharp like the moment before a storm. I looked at my daughter. Her cheek was bright red. Her hands were still half raised, as if she did not know what to do with them now that she was not clapping. She looked like a child again. Not the grown woman I had raised. Not the strong bright soul I had nurtured. She looked fragile, scared, conditioned. I walked toward her slowly, afraid that sudden movement would frighten her even more. When I reached her I touched her arm gently. She flinched. My heart broke again. I wanted to pull her into my arms. I wanted to take her away right then. But I knew fear this deep does not vanish simply because comfort arrives. It hides. It curls inward. It waits for permission to release itself. Her husband spoke then with a tone that made my skin crawl. He said it was just a disagreement. He said she was overreacting. He said many things that twisted the truth into something unrecognizable. But my daughter did not speak. She only kept her eyes on the floor. And that silence told me more than words ever could. I knew at that moment that this was not the first time he had raised his hand. I knew this was not the first slap or the first insult or the first moment she was forced to applaud in order to survive. I knew this was not an accident. This was a pattern, a system, a quiet cruelty that had been growing behind closed doors while I trusted that she was happy. My hands began to shake. Not from fear but from rage. A kind of rage I had never felt before in my life. A mother's rage. A sacred primal protective rage that rises only when her child is harmed. The kind that can lift cars off bodies. The kind that can walk through fire without feeling the heat. The kind that can turn a soft, gentle woman into a force that nothing in the world can stop. In that moment I made a silent promise to myself. I would not leave her alone again. I would not walk away and pretend to trust that she would be all right. I would not tolerate one more tear, one more bruise, one more forced applause from the person who vowed to love her but instead chose to control her. I reached for her hand. She hesitated for a second, then placed her trembling fingers in mine. That tiny motion held more fear than any scream could ever carry. And in that moment the truth became clear. My daughter needed help, real help, urgent help, and if she could not ask for it herself, then I would ask for her. I would fight for her. I would protect her the way I should have protected her long ago. I did not know then what the rest of the day would bring. I did not know what choices I would make or what consequences they would carry. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. The moment I saw that slap, the moment I heard that applause, the moment I felt her trembling hand reach for mine, I understood that everything needed to change. And it needed to change now. When my daughter lifted her hands and began to applaud after the slap, it felt like the world stopped turning for a moment. I had seen fear in people before, and I had even lived through moments of fear myself, yet nothing prepared me for the sight of my own child clapping for the man who had just struck her. Her palms touched again and again, creating a faint trembling sound that echoed inside my chest like a slow breaking of glass. At first I thought she was trying to diffuse the tension or distract him or pretend that everything was fine. But then I saw her face. I saw the empty look in her eyes. A look that did not belong to her. A look that belonged to someone who had been trained through repeated punishment and fear to respond in ways that protected her from further harm. That applause was not praise. It was survival. Her hands shook with every soft slap against each other, and I could see the tiny movements of her fingers like someone who had done this more times than she could count. This was not the first time she had used applause to avoid anger or further violence. This was not something she invented in that moment. This was a practiced reaction, one built slowly by fear and enforced by the man who claimed to be her partner. I felt the truth sink into my bones with a weight I had never felt before. She was not living a life. She was living a performance. A performance she had been forced to perfect. I watched her husband as she clapped. The way he stood there with his chin slightly lifted and his hands on his hips told me everything I needed to know. He expected that applause. He felt entitled to it. He wanted it as a sign of his control and dominance. He had shaped her reactions through threats, insults, and emotional manipulation until she no longer knew how to respond freely. Every movement she made was guided by a fear that had carved itself deep into her spirit. I could see it even in the way she breathed. Shallow, tight, controlled breaths, like someone afraid to take up too much air in the room. My daughter kept her eyes lowered while she clapped. She never looked at him. She never looked at me either. She looked somewhere in the middle distance, as if she was trying to disappear. As if her mind had learned to retreat to a safer place inside her whenever he became violent. Her applause seemed to belong to a different person. Not the bright, lively girl I once knew. Not the woman who used to throw her head back and laugh until tears rolled down her cheeks. This version of her felt dimmed. Like a flame smothered by dust. Like a voice muted by fear. There was something haunting in the way her hands kept moving with that automatic rhythm. The soft taps of her palms carried a message I could not fully understand until the moment stretched on long enough to reveal its meaning. That applause was her way of saying, please do not hit me again. Please do not explode. Please let this be enough. It was her way of surviving a moment she had learned to fear long before I walked into that room. Her husband had conditioned her so deeply that she believed appeasement was the only path to safety. I could almost imagine the scenes that must have happened before. The arguments that escalated. The threats that forced her into silence. The tears she probably cried behind closed doors. The apologies she must have whispered to herself to get through the night. She might have clapped before. Maybe not always with her hands. Maybe sometimes with forced smiles or quiet obedience, or shrinking herself into the background. Abuse shapes people in different ways. It teaches them traits they never wanted or needed. It trains them to anticipate anger before it arrives and to mold themselves into shapes that keep danger at bay. As she continued to clap, I could see her shoulders trembling ever so slightly. A tiny shaking that revealed the truth behind her still posture. She was terrified. She was exhausted. She was trapped in a cycle that had slowly eroded her sense of freedom. I felt my heart breaking piece by piece as I watched her. Every clap felt like a cry for help disguised as obedience. Every movement of her hands told a story of pain she had kept hidden from me for far too long. Her husband watched her with a cold satisfaction, as if her reaction confirmed something he believed about himself. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. In the way he stared at her like she was an object he controlled rather than a human he should care for. He seemed proud of the effect he had on her. Proud of how quickly she responded. As if her applause was proof of his power. That look in his eyes filled me with a level of rage I had never known was possible. A rage that grew silently inside me like a roaring fire waiting for a spark. My daughter finally stopped clapping after a few more soft strikes of her palms. Her breath came out in a shaky, slow release, like someone trying not to cry. She lowered her hands slowly, as if she feared moving too quickly would trigger another reaction. Her cheek still burned bright red from the slap and her eyes shimmered with unshed tears she dared not let fall. She swallowed hard and lifted her chin a tiny inch as if she wanted to appear strong. But the strength she showed in that moment was not the strength of the life she once had. It was the strength of someone trying desperately to hold herself together in the presence of danger. I stepped closer and she flinched again. Not because she feared me, but because her body had been trained to expect harm from sudden movement. That flinch broke something inside me. I thought of all the nights she must have sat alone wondering how she ended up in such a life. I thought of the dreams she once had and the bright future she imagined before she married him. I wondered when exactly her applause replaced her laughter. When her fear replaced her freedom. When her silence replaced her voice. I wanted to take her away right then and there. But I knew that if I pushed too hard she would fold into the fear her husband had built around her. People conditioned by abuse often protect their abusers because they fear the consequences of breaking the cycle. They fear the explosive anger that follows disobedience. They fear losing the small scraps of peace they have learned to cling to. They fear that escape might be more dangerous than staying. And looking at her face, I understood she was carrying all those fears at once. She tried to say something then. Her lips parted slightly but no words came out. It was as if her voice had been stolen. As if she had forgotten how to speak freely. Her husband glared at her with a look that warned her to stay silent, and she obeyed immediately. That instant reaction told me everything. He did not simply control her actions. He controlled her voice. He controlled her thoughts. He controlled her fear. He controlled every fragile moment of her life. I reached out and touched her hand gently. I wanted her to feel at least for a second that someone in the room cared about her safety. She squeezed my fingers ever so slightly, but the pressure was weak, like a whisper of strength trying to survive beneath layers of fear. I felt her trembling through her touch. A trembling that held the weight of countless moments of anguish. I wanted to tell her she was safe now. But I knew she would not believe it. Not yet. Not while he stood there watching. Her applause replayed in my mind even though the sound had faded. That small sad rhythm became a symbol of everything she had endured. A reminder that she had been living in fear for far too long. A warning that if I walked away she would continue to suffer. I knew she had clapped because she thought it would stop him from becoming worse. She had learned to predict his anger the way a sailor learns to predict storms. She knew before he even raised his hand that a certain reaction might protect her. That applause was her shield. Fragile, heartbreaking, but hers. As I stood there looking at her, I made a silent vow. I would not let her applaud another moment of pain. I would not let her live another day believing obedience was her only path to safety. I would not let fear rule her life. She had clapped for him out of fear, but I would fight for her out of love. And unlike that applause, my intervention would not be quiet. It would not be soft. It would not be obedient. It would be fierce and unstoppable. When my daughter stopped clapping, the room shifted in a way that felt almost unnatural. Silence settled like a heavy blanket, suffocating every corner of the space. For a moment no one moved. Not me, not her, not the man who stood between us like some dark shadow that refused to fade. But then something happened. Something small but powerful. My daughter lowered her gaze even further, and in that tiny motion I saw the exact moment her husband realized his mask had slipped. He could no longer pretend. He could no longer hide behind the polite, charming act he showed everyone else. With me standing there with the evidence of his cruelty hanging thick in the air, he had no reason to pretend anymore. And he did not try. He turned toward me slowly with a look that sent a chill through my bones. It was not shock. It was not guilt. It was not even embarrassment. It was irritation. Pure irritation, as if my presence in that room had disrupted his routine. As if I had stepped into a world he controlled and he did not appreciate my interference. His eyes narrowed slightly and I could feel the hostility radiating from him like heat from a fire. In that moment I saw who he truly was. Not the polite man who shook my hand at family gatherings. Not the man who smiled in photos. Not the man who once brought flowers to my daughter's birthday dinner. No, I was staring at the real version of him. The one he kept hidden from the world. The one my daughter had been living with. His voice came next, low, slow, and coated with a false calm that only made the rage underneath it more terrifying. He said that it was nothing. He said that I should knock next time. He said that it was normal for couples to disagree. His words were empty shells that carried no truth at all. They were sentences crafted to make himself appear rational while painting the situation as a misunderstanding. But I could feel the truth vibrating under every syllable he spoke. He was not explaining. He was warning. He was telling me to mind my place. Telling me he believed he had authority even over me in my own daughter's home. I could see his jaw shift as he clenched his teeth. His fingers twitched slightly as if he was restraining an impulse. The way he glared at my daughter made her shrink in fear, and I knew then that this was a man used to dominance. A man who believed control was something he deserved. A man who believed every emotion, every movement, every breath in that house belonged to him. He stared at her with the cold intensity of someone who expected obedience and punished anything less. Seeing that look confirmed what my heart already knew. This was not a moment of anger. This was a pattern. This was a system. This was a life my daughter had been trapped in for far too long. As he spoke, his voice grew sharper, as though he felt the need to re-establish the control he believed I was threatening. He took a small step forward, and though the movement was slight, it carried a dangerous message. He wanted to intimidate me. He wanted to let me know that he was not afraid of my presence. That he was still the one in charge. But he underestimated something important. He underestimated the strength of a mother. He underestimated the bravery that rises when a mother sees her child being harmed. He did not understand that nothing on earth could make me back down now that I had seen the truth. I looked at my daughter again. Her hands hung at her sides like wilted branches. Her shoulders were hunched. Her breathing was unsteady. She looked smaller than she had ever looked in her life. Not physically but spiritually. She looked like she had learned to disappear inside herself just to survive the storms he created. And yet even in that fragile moment I could see a tiny spark in her eyes. A spark that appeared the second she realized I had seen everything. A spark that told me she was waiting for someone to stand by her. Someone to break the cycle. Someone to say the words she could not speak. The son-in-law noticed that spark too, and his expression twisted with a kind of territorial anger. As if her brief sense of hope threatened him. That reaction showed me more truth than any confession ever could. He thrived on her fear. He relied on her silence. He needed her obedience the same way a starving man needs food. It was not just about anger. It was about power. He wanted to own her emotions. He wanted to own her reactions. He wanted to own her future. The slap was only one piece of the cruelty. The applause was another. The silence was another. He had created an entire system around her that kept her trapped. Like a cage built slowly over years until she no longer remembered what freedom felt like. When he stepped closer to her, she flinched again. A small heartbreaking motion that spoke volumes about the world she had been living in. He noticed her flinch and smirked. A small curling of his lip that made my stomach twist with disgust. That smirk told me he enjoyed the fear. He fed on it. He used it as proof that he controlled every part of her life. He turned to me again and said that I should stay out of their personal matters. He said I was interfering. He said I was making things worse. He spoke as if he believed he had authority even over me. His arrogance filled the room like a foul scent. But I saw something else too. Something deeper. As he spoke, I noticed a flicker in his eyes. A quick flash of worry. He tried to hide it, but a mother knows how to read the smallest signals. He realized that his control had been interrupted. He sensed that my presence brought a shift he could not command. He saw that I was not afraid of him. And that threatened him far more than anything else. My daughter dared to look at me for a second. Her eyes filled with a silent plea. She did not need to say a word. I understood exactly what she was telling me. Help me. I cannot do this alone. I am scared. I do not know how to escape. Her husband saw that silent exchange and something dark flashed across his face. A dangerous energy. His shoulders tensed. His jaw hardened. He looked ready to lash out again. Perhaps not at her. Perhaps at me. And that was when something inside me rose like a force of nature. A mother's fury. A mother's strength. A mother's unbreakable will. I straightened my shoulders and met his stare with a calmness that surprised even me. Not because I did not fear him, but because my love for my daughter was stronger than any threat he could pose. He expected me to back down. He expected me to apologize or step aside or leave. But I did neither. I stood my ground. I let the silence between us speak for itself. My refusal to move shook the foundation of his control. I could feel it. He could feel it. And for the first time since I walked into that house, he did not look annoyed. He looked uncertain. My daughter saw that uncertainty. I saw her chest rise with a deeper breath than before, as if she had found a tiny moment of safety in my presence. It was only a flicker, but it was the first flicker of hope she had shown since I arrived. Her eyes held mine again, and this time the fear remained, but there was a faint new light beneath it. A sense of possibility. A sense that maybe this was not the end of her story. Maybe she could be free. Maybe she could reclaim the life he had slowly taken from her. Her husband noticed that shift too, and his mask cracked further. His false charm faded entirely, and what stood in its place was pure resentment and pure frustration. He snapped at her, a sharp bark of words that were meant to intimidate her back into silence. But she did not lower her eyes this time. She kept looking at me. And in that small defiant act one knew the spell he had placed over her was beginning to break. The son-in-law escalated, then trying to regain control of the situation. His voice grew louder. His posture grew more aggressive. He spoke in sharp sentences filled with threats disguised as warnings. But I did not move. I did not flinch. And my daughter saw that. With every second I stood there I could feel her gaining a tiny bit of courage. A tiny bit of strength. A tiny bit of belief that this nightmare did not have to continue. The moment the son-in-law realized he was losing his grip was the moment his true nature fully revealed itself. A man desperate for control. A man terrified of losing power. A man who had built his entire identity around dominating someone weaker than himself. He stared at me with an intensity that would have frightened most people. But he made a mistake. He forgot that a mother who sees her child in danger fears nothing. And that was when I knew. I knew without hesitation that I would not let this moment fade quietly. I would not let him recover his control. I would not let my daughter return to a life of fear. The real him had shown himself and I had seen every dark corner of his cruelty. The mask was gone. The truth was exposed. And now that I had seen it I would never allow him to hide behind charm again. The moment I realized that my daughter's entire spirit had been pushed into silence, something inside me shifted in a way I had never felt before. It was not anger alone. It was not shock alone. It was something deeper and older. Something ancient that lives inside every mother. A force that rises only when her child is standing on the edge of something dangerous and dark. As I stood there watching her tremble, watching her shrink into herself, watching her husband tower over her with that smug look that told me he believed he still owned the room, I felt that force take hold of me. It was a fire that did not burn but instead illuminated everything I needed to understand. My daughter was in danger. My daughter was drowning in fear. My daughter needed someone to stand for her because she could no longer stand for herself. I reached toward her gently, almost afraid she might pull away again. She did flinch, but this time she did not retreat. She allowed my hand to rest lightly on her arm. Her skin felt cold, not the cold of winter air but the cold that comes from living in fear for too long. The cold that comes from never feeling safe. Her eyes lifted just a little. A small hesitant upward movement that revealed a fragile glimmer of trust. She was looking at me as if trying to decide if I was truly there or if her mind was creating a moment of hope where none existed. When she finally met my gaze I saw something I had not seen in her eyes in months. A plea. A silent plea that I could not ignore. Her husband saw that exchange and his expression tightened with a dark fury. He stepped forward as if trying to place himself between us, as if trying to shield her from my influence. But he was not shielding her from me. He was trying to shield her from the truth. The truth that she did not have to stay. The truth that he no longer controlled every breath she took. The truth that someone stronger than his cruelty had stepped into the room. I watched his movement closely and stepped in front of my daughter without thinking. My body acted before my mind could analyze the risk. I became a barrier, a wall, a shield. I did not plan it. I simply moved because instinct told me to. He stopped walking when he saw me place myself between them. His eyes widened for a split second as if he had never considered the possibility that someone might stand up to him. He straightened his shoulders and tried to mask his surprise with arrogance. He told me to step back. He told me to leave. He told me that I had no right to interfere in his marriage. But his words carried a tone that revealed fear beneath the anger. A fear he refused to acknowledge. A fear of losing control. A fear of my presence. A fear of exposure. I did not move. I did not step aside. I did not even respond right away. I let the silence fill the space between us like a storm waiting to break. My daughter stood behind me holding her breath. I could feel her trembling through the air itself like waves radiating from a wounded heart. The heaviness of her fear settled on my shoulders and gave me strength. She had been carrying this weight alone for too long. I would carry it with her now. Or for her if she could not. Then I spoke. My voice came out steady in a way that surprised me. It did not shake. It did not rise. It did not falter. It was firm and clear like a bell striking in the middle of the night. I told him that what I had witnessed was not a disagreement. I told him that raising a hand to my daughter was something I would never tolerate. I told him that her safety was no longer up for negotiation. He tried to interrupt me, but I held up my hand, and the command in that gesture made him pause. For the first time since I walked into the house he hesitated. I could see anger rising in him like steam from boiling water. His nostrils flared, his jaw shifted, his shoulders pulled back in an attempt to appear intimidating. But intimidation has no place when a mother stands firm. A mother does not bend when her child's life is at risk. A mother does not cower when danger stands in front of her. A mother does not retreat. I watched him try to gather his authority again, but he could not find it. It slipped from his grasp like sand through stiff fingers. Because I had taken back something he had not expected to lose. Control of the moment. I turned slightly toward my daughter and whispered that she was coming with me. Her eyes widened, and for a moment fear replaced hope. She whispered back that she could not leave. Her voice trembled so softly I almost missed the words. She said he would get angry. She said he would punish her. She said she did not know what he would do. Her fear was so deep that it shaped her thoughts before she could even consider escape. That is the kind of fear that grows in a home controlled by abuse. It makes the victim believe leaving is more dangerous than staying. It makes them believe obedience is their only shield. I squeezed her hand gently and told her that she was not alone. That she did not need his permission to be safe. That she was coming with me, and nothing he said or did would stop that. I felt her fingers tighten around mine. It was a weak grip, but it was enough. Enough to tell me that somewhere inside her the woman she used to be was still fighting to return. Even buried under fear, she still held a spark of courage. Her husband saw us holding hands and something snapped inside him. He lunged forward, not with full force, not yet, but with a sudden aggressive step meant to startle her back into submission. But this time I did not let him close the gap. I stepped in front of him again, my stance firm and unmoving. He shouted at me then. His voice filled the room with a sharp, brutal sound. He claimed I was ruining everything. He claimed I was overreacting. He claimed my daughter needed him, but the desperation in his tone told another story. He needed her silence. He needed her obedience. He needed her fear. Without those things his entire foundation collapsed. My daughter clung to my sleeve as he yelled. She hid behind me the way a child hides behind her mother on the first day of school. I felt her tears wetting the fabric of my blouse. I did not turn around because turning around would have signaled weakness, and a moment of weakness was something I could not afford. Not now. He had to see me strong. My daughter had to see me strong. Strength was the only thing that could shift this moment. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. A cold, hollow laugh that held no humor. A laugh that sounded like the cracking of ice under pressure. He told me that my daughter would never leave him. He told me that she belonged there. He told me that she needed to learn how to behave. The arrogance in his voice mixed with the cruelty of his words made something inside me snap in return. Not with violence, but with clarity, crystal sharp clarity. My daughter did not belong in that house. My daughter did not belong under that cruelty. My daughter did not belong in the hands of someone who believed he owned her spirit. And I would not leave without her, no matter what he said. I reached for my phone, slowly making sure he saw the movement. His eyes followed my hand, and I watched uncertainty ripple across his face. I did not have to say anything. He knew exactly what that phone could do. He knew exactly who I could call. He knew exactly how quickly his entire world could crumble. For the first time his confidence faltered. His breathing shifted. His posture loosened. And in that small unraveling I saw victory. I turned to my daughter and told her we were leaving now. Not later. Not someday. Now. Her breath caught in her throat. She nodded slowly, as if afraid the moment would disappear if she moved too quickly. She took a small step forward and then another. Each step was a victory. Each step broke a chain he had wrapped around her mind. Each step reminded her that she was capable of choosing her own future. When she reached my side, her husband tried to block the doorway. But this time my voice became ice. I told him to move. I told him his control was over. I told him that if he touched her again even once, the consequences would be far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Something in my tone made him freeze. The fire inside me burned too brightly for him to challenge. I led my daughter toward the door while he stood rooted to the floor, his face twisted with rage and fear. And in that moment I realized something important. He had never been strong. He had only ever been controlling. And control is nothing when it meets true strength. When I stepped out of that room and felt the silence stretching like a tightrope ready to snap, I knew I had reached the point of no return, and I knew that if I walked away again I would be choosing his comfort over her life. The weight of that truth pressed against my chest like a stone, and I felt something inside me shift, something old, something fierce, something that had lived inside me long before I became a mother but had only awakened in moments of deep danger. I had never been one to start fights, but I had never been one to lose them either, and that day I was not just a woman and not just a mother, I was the shield that had been waiting too long to rise. I looked back at my daughter and saw her curled in on herself like a small animal trying to disappear, and that image carved itself into me, and I knew it would never leave. The bruises on her spirit were louder than the bruise on her cheek, and the terror in her eyes felt like a silent scream echoing through my bones. I wanted to pick her up, hold her close and tell her she was safe, but I also knew that safety had to be more than a promise spoken softly in a room full of fear. It had to be an action, a force, a decision that could not be undone. I walked outside and almost broke when the door closed behind me because the air felt different, like the world had taken a breath with me, like the universe was waiting to see what I would choose. My hands shook not from fear but from adrenaline as I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. For a moment I hesitated because I knew that once I made this call there would be no going back. Lives would change, trust would be shattered, lies would be exposed, and the man who had hurt my daughter would learn what it meant to strike the child of a woman who had survived much more powerful monsters than him. But hesitation was a luxury I no longer allowed myself. I dialed the number of the one person who had always said, "If you ever need me for anything big or small, you call and I will be there," before the second ring. He was not a friend and not a neighbor and not a relative I spoke to often, but he was someone who had once owed me something, and he had never forgotten that debt. He was a man who handled things in a way that most people would not understand, but I understood him because I knew what it meant to stand on the edge of justice and vengeance and choose the path that protected the innocent. The phone rang once, then twice, and then a deep voice answered with a single word, a name he had always used for me because he said I was the only person who ever spoke to him like he had a soul. I told him where I was and I told him what this man had done, and the silence that followed was heavier than thunder, and it told me everything I needed to know. He said, "I will be there," and that was all. He did not ask for an explanation, he did not doubt me, he did not ask if I was sure. He trusted me, and that trust felt like a weapon in my hand. I hung up the phone and felt the world shift in my favor. There is a power that comes from choosing action over fear, and I felt it rise inside me like a tide, strong and unstoppable. For years I had told myself that interfering in my daughter's marriage would only make things worse, but what could be worse than letting her live in fear of the man who shared her home? My inaction had fed his confidence and my silence had strengthened his cruelty, but now the quiet was ending and the consequences were coming for him like a storm he could not outrun. I went back into the house and found him sitting on the couch, chest puffed out like he had won something. He looked at me with that smug grin that always made my skin crawl, and he said, "I hope you did not call anyone who thinks they can change what happens in my house." My daughter flinched when she heard his voice, and that tiny reaction lit another fire in me. This was not his house anymore, and it never had been, because a real home is built on love, not on fear. I walked past him without a word and sat beside my daughter, taking her hand gently and whispering that she was not alone anymore. She tried to pull her hand away because she was afraid he would see, but I held it tighter because I wanted her to feel the strength in me, the strength she had forgotten she came from. He stood up and started pacing like a man preparing for a show of dominance, but there was something different in the room now, something he could not name but could feel. Power had shifted and he did not know why. Minutes later there was a knock on the door. A slow, steady knock that did not sound like fear or uncertainty. It sounded like arrival, like purpose, like truth stepping into the open. My son-in-law froze mid-step and the color drained from his face because something in that knock told him his world was about to split open. He looked at me like he was searching for the old version of me, the one he thought he could intimidate, but she was gone, replaced by someone built from steel and fury and love. I stood and walked to the door, and when I opened it, the man waiting outside greeted me with a nod that held years of respect and unspoken understanding. He stepped inside quietly and the air shifted again, heavy and sharp. My son-in-law stumbled back like prey, realizing too late that the hunter had entered the room. There were no threats spoken, no shouting, no chaos, only a cold, steady truth settling between the walls. The man I had called asked me one question in a tone calm and lethal: "Do you want him gone?" I looked at my daughter, her trembling hands, her silent tears, her shrinking posture, and everything inside me screamed yes. Not just gone, but unable to ever hurt her again. I nodded once and the man turned toward my son-in-law with a look that stripped the arrogance right off his skin. What happened next did not need noise or violence. It was the kind of justice that unfolds in quiet, decisive movements. A warning delivered so clearly that my son-in-law felt it in the deepest part of his fear. Papers were presented, resources arranged, options removed, protections set in place, layers of consequences stacked on top of each other like walls closing in. By the time it was over, he knew that touching her again would end his life as he knew it. Not through fists or revenge fantasies, but through legal power, through reputation collapse, through every door closing on him at once. He packed his things that night, shaken, pale, and stripped of every ounce of dominance he had once wielded. He looked at me like I had become something he had never expected, a threat, a force, a lioness protecting her blood. And maybe I had. I did not flinch and I did not apologize. I only said, "If you ever raise your hand at her again, you will wish the only thing you lost was your home." He left with more fear than pride, and when the door closed behind him, my daughter finally broke into tears, the kind that tear the soul but heal it too. I held her and whispered that she was safe now, not because I promised but because I acted. And as she cried into my shoulder, I felt the weight lift, the weight of years of silence, guilt, uncertainty. I had made the call, I had chosen my daughter, and I would choose her every time. That night revenge did not look like punishment. It looked like a mother reclaiming her power and giving her daughter the chance to reclaim her own. In the days after he walked out of that house, something gentle began to return to the air, like a warm breeze after a long, cruel winter. My daughter moved slowly at first, as if every step might awaken some invisible threat that had followed her for years. Her body carried the memory of fear like a shadow that clung even when the sun was shining. I watched her wake each morning with that same sudden jolt of dread, expecting his heavy voice or his angry footsteps, but each time she opened her eyes and found only quiet, she breathed a little deeper, a little freer. Healing is not a dramatic moment, it is 1,000 small moments stitched together, and I saw those stitches forming day by day. The first real change came one morning when she made herself a cup of tea and actually sat down to drink it. Not standing, not rushing, not bracing herself for something to erupt. She sat and sipped as if the simple act of tasting warmth was permission to exist again. Her hands used to tremble when she held anything fragile, but that morning they were steady, and she stared at her fingers like she was seeing them for the first time, not as tools to serve someone but as part of a person who deserved peace. I sat across from her, pretending to read but truly watching the slow return of her spirit like a flower pushing through cold soil. Then one afternoon I found her standing by the window, sunlight on her face, eyes closed, breathing slowly. I asked her gently what she was doing, and she said, "I am trying to remember what it felt like to belong to myself." Those words nearly broke me because they held the truth of everything she had endured and the strength of everything she was reclaiming. She was not just healing, she was rebuilding the parts he had tried to erase. She was learning the sound of her own voice again and the shape of her own thoughts. It reminded me of a young girl I once raised, one who laughed loudly and dreamed boldly and had never been told she was too much or too little. At night she still woke from dreams heavy with old fear, but now she reached for my hand instead of hiding in silence. I sat with her through those long quiet hours, holding her while she trembled, whispering that she was safe and that her life was hers again. Slowly those nightmares loosened their grip and she began to sleep longer each night, sometimes even smiling in her dreams like her soul was remembering joy. Trauma tries to convince you that safety is temporary, but healing teaches you that peace is possible, and I could see that lesson beginning to root itself inside her. The first time she went outside alone, she paused at the door for a long while, like the world beyond the house was something sharp or dangerous. But when she stepped out into the open air, she lifted her chin slightly like a woman rediscovering her power. She walked down the street slowly at first, then with a steadier pace, her shoulders unfolding little by little. When she came back she said it felt strange to walk without checking behind her, and that simple sentence held years of exhaustion. But she went out again the next day and the next until her fear softened and her confidence grew. There was a moment about 2 weeks later that I knew she had truly begun to heal. She walked past a mirror in the hallway and instead of shrinking away or avoiding her reflection she stopped and looked at herself. Not with shame or apology but with quiet evaluation, as if trying to understand the woman looking back. Her hair fell loosely around her face and her eyes, though tired, had a new steadiness. She touched her cheek gently right where the bruise once sat and whispered, "It does not own me anymore." I felt tears sting my eyes because that was not the voice of a victim, that was the voice of a survivor stepping back into her life. One evening she surprised me by playing music in the kitchen. Soft at first, then louder, as if she were testing how much space she was allowed to take. She moved around with a softness that grew into something bolder, and I saw a tiny spark of the girl who used to dance barefoot in the living room on Saturday mornings. She hummed under her breath and there was a lightness in her movements that had been missing for years. Music has a way of awakening forgotten parts, and I could see those parts returning like long-lost friends. She also began talking more slowly, at first in short guarded sentences, then with growing ease. She told me things she had held inside for so long, things she thought no one would believe or understand. I listened without interrupting because she did not need solutions, she needed release. Each confession lifted a little of the weight she had carried in silence. She spoke about fear, confusion, shame, and the loneliness that had wrapped around her like a second skin. And with every word she reclaimed pieces of herself he had tried to break. Healing is not neat and not quick, but it is real and powerful, and I saw it take shape with every conversation. The day she laughed again felt like a sunrise breaking through a storm. It was not a small laugh or a polite one, but a real full sound that came from deep inside her. Something had genuinely amused her, and when she laughed I felt something inside me burst with both relief and gratitude. That laugh was proof that the woman she once was still alive inside her, waiting for room to breathe. I had missed that laugh more than I realized. As she grew stronger I gently encouraged her to see a counselor, someone who could help her navigate the deeper wounds. She resisted at first, doubting her strength or feeling embarrassed, but eventually she agreed. After her first session she came home quiet but lighter, as if she had set down a heavy bag she had carried too far. Over time counseling gave her words for her pain and understanding for her fear and tools for her future. She learned that none of what happened was her fault. She learned that she could build a life without him. She learned that she deserved respect, safety, and love. One of the most remarkable signs of her healing came the day she began making plans for her own future again. She talked about getting a job, maybe going back to school, maybe moving to a place that felt like a fresh start. These were not the dreams of a broken woman, these were the dreams of a woman stepping into her next chapter. She began journaling, writing lists, setting goals, small ones at first, then bigger ones. The spark of ambition I once saw in her as a young woman was glowing again, stronger each day. The final piece of her healing came quietly one morning when she sat beside me with a calm, steady expression. She said she no longer wanted revenge, she only wanted peace. That was when I knew she had risen beyond the damage, beyond the fear, beyond the shadows. The man who hurt her no longer lived in her mind or her heart. She had freed herself not just from him but from the version of herself he had molded with his cruelty. She had chosen growth and strength and self-love, and that was the greatest victory of all. Watching her transform was like watching a wilted tree begin to bloom again. Slowly, gently, beautifully, she reclaimed her body, her choices, her voice, her identity, her worth. And in doing so she taught me something too. She taught me that survival is not the end, healing is. She showed me that a woman broken can become a woman unshakable. She reminded me that a mother's love can spark change, but a daughter's courage is what builds the future. She is free now, not just from him but from the fear he planted and the silence he demanded. She walks with her shoulders square, her eyes bright, her voice steady. She is learning joy again, learning trust, learning hope. And every day I thank the universe that she did not stay lost in that darkness. She came back to herself, and in doing so she came back to life. And I will tell you this with absolute certainty. Nothing is more powerful than a woman who has survived her own storm and chosen to rise anyway.